Hello and welcome to the second of 6 videos from the Roman Army 2021 UofW lecture on life and stuff after war. In the second video, I'm just going to say a little bit about living arrangements for soldiers. Okay, so all right. Oh yeah, watch videos. Yeah, we can't watch videos. So lots of soldiers lived in forts and fortlets. Fortlets being smaller forts, forts being big ones. They come in a variety of sizes, which changed over time. Forts became more permanent entities connected to the military in the 1st century CE, second half of it even. There had been earlier ones made of less permanent materials, wood and what have you. And before that, it was all the temporary marching camps that we know about. And the forts that emerged that were permanent were basically like permanent versions of these marching camps, such as you find in Polybius and elsewhere. So, in theory, soldiers live in barracks. Here are the barracks, or a picture of the foundation of the barracks, partly restored and whatever, at Caerleon, Isca, in Wales. And so, we would expect to find soldiers living there with their tent mates. Contubernium was a tent mate, someone who lived within the tent, although obviously these are permanent, usually 8 to 10 in size, and these are the band of brothers, so-called, or like the band of brothers associated with more recent militaries. These might be some of the men, in theory, that they would have the closest social bonds with, because these are the ones they would see on a regular basis, although we'll come back to who's living there in a second. But there's also all sorts of civilian settlements associated with this. A lot of the places the soldiers ended up, there maybe weren't permanent or sizable population centers, and that often meant, putting in place some of the structures the Romans might need, as well as then coming up with means of importing goods. Once things were set up, let's call it the commercial networks would increase, and there would be more opportunities for producing things locally. And, well, I said there the Roman soldiers were eco-friendly. To some degree they were, in the sense that they produced a lot of the stuff that they consumed locally in the region, both around the fort and then in the not too distant region. Okay. Now, there were all these civilian settlements that grew up around them. Not always, but quite often. Some of these were called canabi. These are the ones usually associated with legions that we find growing up around legionary forts. They might start off as more temporary ones involving a wide range of people, but they would usually become permanent, and cities and so on could develop from them. The ones around auxiliary forts, which are usually smaller because they're smaller units, would be called wiki. Sort of the same idea. If the communities got big enough, they could eventually become colonia. Sort of a colonia was a colony, which meant certain, not just colony in the way that we might think of it, but Roman colony. Going back a ways, initially a place in which veterans would be settled upon the conclusion of their service. And these would be spread in various places across the empire. It means to repay them for their service. The practice sort of stopped after Hadrian, and really it came to be associated also with a special legal privilege afforded to the settlement and its position, and canabi could be upgraded. If things went well enough, then a colony could even become a municipium, and in that case, it would get even additional legal privileges. Okay. The final point I just want to say is that not everyone. So there are forts and fortlets and some towers and the civilian communities that emerge around them, but there are also cities. And one of the pseudo divides that we find is, especially in the imperial era, going from Augustus to later, is soldiers in the west maybe settling more often in forts, permanent structures, where there hadn't been as much, as I said, settlement before. In the east, where there were long-standing cities and places soldiers might be stationed within urban environments. And a good example of this is Dura Europos, which has been the subject of a great deal of work. For instance, there's a quite new book by Simon James, which goes into detail of the space inside and where the soldiers live. And this image perhaps predates that book, so it's probably out of date. But what we find, for instance, that it used to be the case, or one of the earlier views, is that this corridor up here of Dura Europos, and here's the Euphrates River, this frontier city was where the soldiers were based, and the civilians and everything were in the rest of the city. But now, there's good evidence to suggest, not just Simon James, but also Jen Baird and Birkbeck, that the soldiers are living in houses and in the broader community with others. Okay. So those are some of the places where soldiers live. And now really the next videos are looking into who was living there. And I already said tent mates, contubernium, but I also hinted at the presence of family members, civilians. That's coming up.